The theme of today's video is the way of a disciple, obedience and service in the world. And in today's video, I want to look at what obedience and service in the world actually looks like. But first, a quick summary of today's first reading. In today's first reading, Paul continues his exhortation to the Philippians, this time with his appeal for obedience and service in the world. And looking at today's gospel, we learn what it looks like to be disciples of Christ. That we must first accept detachment from any possessions or anything that is not putting Christ first. And second, that accepting the call to be a disciple of Jesus requires persecution and suffering. So let's begin with the way of a disciple, obedience. In Philippians 2, verse 12, Paul begins his message that we should work out our salvation with fear and trembling. That this working out our salvation in fear and trembling references this awe and seriousness when it comes to service to God. Likewise, when we turn to today's gospel, we see another reference of what obedience looks like as it relates to the way of a disciple. Looking at Luke 14, verse 26, Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." For a second time, Jesus says in verse 33, "Every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. That whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." So Jesus starts by painting a pretty clear picture of what it looks like to not be his disciple. And it's all rooted in obedience to detaching oneself from any possession, and in addition, accepting that we have to carry our own cross. See, a good question to consider is, have we considered the cost required to be a disciple of Jesus? You see, in the readings that we find today, it requires total dedication to Christ, even accepting persecution and suffering. Next, when it comes to the way of a disciple, service in the world, turning back to Philippians verses 14 through 15, Paul says that we should do everything without grumbling or questioning. Now, let's stop here for a moment. There's a difference between questioning aspects of our faith and questioning the will of God. I like to call this particular instruction the promised land effect. Inspired by the way of the Israelites who had been freed from God by the Egyptian Pharaoh, who had been living in slavery and who had cried out to God. God comes down to rescue the Israelites, sending Moses to be the leader in charge. So at the time of them going through and wandering through the desert, we see that the Israelites grumbled against God and Moses, questioning the leadership and even whether or not they should continue on, questioning whether or not they should return to Egypt where at least they were fed. That they had this willingness in the midst of their own persecution and suffering to actually go back to slavery where they had cried out to God, and through their tears and through their anguish, God hears their cries and rescues them. And yet, in the midst of persecution and suffering, the Israelites start to grumble against God and Moses, questioning the very position where they were. Paul continues on, saying that we may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine like lights in the world. Friends, there's no doubt and there's no question that we live in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. But it's time for us to stop for a moment and check the light bulbs. Just like in your own home, when you notice that there's a dim or empty light bulb in the midst of those around it, it's time to replace that light bulb. In order for us to be the light shining amongst this crooked and perverse generation, Paul says we must do this by holding on to the word of life. This word of life that we see in the first chapter, verses 1 through 5 of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life. And this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. To you, the Christian conservative voter, our focus is on the Lord, who is our light and our salvation. Regardless of who's taking office, God is calling on us to stand out in the midst of this broken and perverse generation. We should not be just another dim or empty light source in a room. We cannot be a disciple of Jesus and put our hope and salvation in a politician, a political party, or even the possessions of our life. We must consider and calculate the cost of following Jesus. We need to identify today and going forward ways to die to self, die to these possessions, and more importantly, identify how we too must pick up and carry our cross with Christ. If you've considered and calculated the cost of following Jesus, what are you grumbling or complaining about? What are you questioning? You see, the answer to those questions lies in who you're following.